Hello everyone, this is part 9 of What If Deku Married Toga, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. The storefront window is as faded as the quality on the television screen behind it, but the dying hues of the image are still identifiable. The subtles that have been put on to substitute for the lack of speakers are still very much readable. The kanji text says the same thing that's being shown. Last night was a shit show. Footage plays of the hell that was raised, a combination of endeavor's flames and fire from destruction of property blending with the window's sun glare. The top story is a US student's death at the hands of supposedly Stain. The name of the deceased is Tenya Ida, a member of the Ingenium family. Endeavor is being proclaimed a hero for catching the killer and stopping the humanoid creatures called Nomu that aided him. Apparently, Stain had been working with the ones responsible for the cataclysm, which just so happens to be the League of Villains. Akitani isn't sure what to make of the information dumped onto him after the matter, especially since he had been a part of it himself. Another big part of the story being woven by the news and media is the return of the Tokyo Ghoul, also cited during the incident. Akitani feels his phone vibrating in his pocket, tearing his attention away from the television momentarily. He only bothers to check it because it could be Himiko trying to call him. Who he's expecting to see attempting to contact him instead is exactly who it turns out to be, though. Eraserhead and his detective friend have left Akitani nearly 100 text messages and just as many missed calls, with half of those calls resulting in voicemail messages. He can't blame them after the news report on the Hosu crisis. He had just wished to have prolonged this inevitability when running away. The TV displays him with his quirk on full display, protecting Himiko from the brawl between Stain and Endeavor. The two of them had used the fight as a diversion for their escape, but didn't get away unscathed. Plenty of flames had licked their arms and legs as they fled. They had also been caught on camera, for the whole world to see. Even with his mask, Akitani had been exposed. Aizawa and Scouchy would no doubt identify him easily. Considering their non-stop effort to get into touch with him, they likely already have. Oi, Akitani, the familiar high-pitched voice of his girlfriend alerts Akitani to her return. Before turning to face her, he crushes his cell phone with the aid of his quirk's strength enhancement. He doesn't know if the police and heroes would be able to track him somehow had he not broken it, but he doesn't want to take the chance of there being a possibility. Plus, he doesn't need the constant reminder of his betrayal towards them. With Himiko back, he doesn't have to worry about keeping the device intact for her to call him either. Himiko isn't alone. Walking alongside her is a man covered in burns despite not having been present that night. Akitani immediately recognizes him as Dabi. He's wearing a long jacket despite the warm weather, hands shoved into its pockets. You've gone and made yourself quite the celebrity. Dabi jokes without a hint of amusement in his tone about the current situation. He gestures with a small nod while asking, afraid of the paparazzi? Akitani's face scrunches up in confusion over the question, before realizing it's rhetorical and why it's being jokingly asked. He tugs at the white medical mask that he's wearing, suddenly remade aware of it covering his mouth. While it does help to conceal his idini, that wasn't the reason he had chosen to wear it. When the bands behind his ears are pulled off, he shows Dabi the burn marks around his mouth. Your dad's AD, dude, Akitani says through scorched lips. Dabi's normally drooped eyelids lift fully and his body stands straight, the initial shock of Akitani's words getting the better of him. He tries shaking it off by returning to his usually bored expression, my dad, though he's missing the slouched demeanor that comes with actual relaxation, he's not. Not wanting to bother with the act, Akitani cuts Dabi off with a deadpan look that says more than any words could. Dabi's mouth stays open, but none of the lies or excuses he was going to use come out of it. Instead, he sighs heavily and asks, how did you know? Akitani simply holds the deadpan look. If it weren't for the burns, he's sure that Dabi would be blushing in embarrassment. The bashful expression alone is enough for them to communicate that the familial ties were obvious. Not to mention the way he acted strangely in his brother's company. Himiko glances between the two, a delighted grin on her face. Eventually, she can't hold it in anymore and lets out a fit of giggles. Akatani almost joins her, but settles for a small smile instead. Dabi groans, not agreeing that having his idini outed is as funny as they think it is. Dabi brings a hand to his forehead, just short of a facepalm as it slides down. Not a single word. He spreads his fingers to peer out at the two teens so they can see how serious he is, to anyone. But Himiko doesn't meet his eyes, still laughing. Dabi's got daddy issues, she continues to casually tease him. Until his tone turns hard to iterate, I'm serious. His hand drops away from his face so he can shoot her a look in order to make her stop. Akatani steps forward, even though he's sure Dabi wouldn't actually do anything to harm her, he can't help but be a bit protective. We'll keep it to ourselves. His own tone is just as hardened and defined. But it softens when he actually takes a moment and looks between his girlfriend and Dabi. We've all got secrets about our past that we want to hide. Himiko and I understand the need for privacy. He meets Dabi's eyes while tacking on at the end, at least a little. Dabi holds his gaze with Akatani, but ultimately breaks it first, changing the subject. His eyes return to making contact as he asks, "You and Stain were tight?" Akatani blinks in surprise, in his head in equal confusion, huh? What makes you think that? It's Dabi's turn to deadpan. He waves a lazy hand in the general direction of the television, it's all over the news. Himiko playfully pouts, crossing her arms under her bust and stamping her feet. She recalls Stain saving her and asks her own question about him, how come you never introduced me to him? I'm your girlfriend, aren't I? It was fairly recent, Himiko, Akatani stammers as he tries to pacify her with an explanation first. Once he gets the blonde to settle down, he returns his attention to Dabi. He respected me. That explanation is a little harder for him to manage, I think. As uncertain as he is of his own relationship to Stain, he also has to wonder why Dabi bothers to care. Why do you ask? Dabi looks away, trying to act casual and bored as always, but his words hold a weight to them that Akatani helps carry with every word that he listens to. When you first came to me looking for that legion or whatever, I thought nothing of it. But they're saying Stain was a part of them. And Stain's philosophy ain't half bad. I'm thinking you and I can get along. Dabi's shoe scrapes the ground as he idly kicks the sidewalk's curb with a gentle swing. Akatani raises his head after hearing Dabi's words. Are you saying? He starts to wonder if the correlation between Stain and the League of Villains also corresponds with Dabi. I know a guy. Calls himself Giran. He's got connections. Dabi confirms those thoughts when he re-meets Akatani's eyeline. I think he can get us in touch with that club you're looking for. Himiko bounces in place, emitting Akatani's inner joy physically for him, though her delighted cheer does earn a side-eyed glance from Dabi. It's just like you wanted, right? She grins happily for him as she eagerly awaits his affirmation. Though, it's rather hard for him to have a smile at the moment. Yeah. So he puts his mask back on to hide the scars again. It's exactly what I wanted. Despite the underground hero's deliberately light step, the first floorboard of the house buckles under his footfall. Instead of creaking, the loose wood groans in protest against the weight of his boot. The ground threatens to break like the furniture that rests atop it. Behind the slits in his yellow goggles, Eraserhead's eyes narrow into a focused squint. Broken bookshelves, their contents spilled out. A destroyed couch and equally splintered chairs. He's not sure yet whether the wake of destruction is a sign of struggle or another type of rampage, but it's concerning to him either way. Behind the inspective hero, Detective Scouchy's rectangular eyes are set in an equal state of strabismus. He too analyzes the damage with a critical gaze, drawing his own conclusions. Eraserhead looks back at him, the two communicating with a quick glance after assessing the environment. Scouchy nods before brandishing his badge from the pocket of his overcoat. Akatani. It's Detective Naomasa Scouchy. I'm coming in. Eraserhead moves aside so that the detective can venture beyond him by a few steps. Each footfall carries through the floorboards just like the hero's first. Let me know you're here if you can hear me. Scouchy cautiously turns the corner at the end of the hall to check another room before calling out again. Akatani. When the detective receives no answer, the underground hero makes an attempt. Kid. His usually gruff voice holds a gentle tone that he ordinarily wouldn't use. It's Aizawa. I'm here too. Scouchy checks over his shoulder, assessing his partner as much as the damage to the atmosphere. When Aizawa meets the gaze, Scouchy looks away. I don't think he's here, the detective sighs while shoving his badge back into his pocket. We should still do a sweep of the house to make sure that it's empty though. The underground hero hums in agreement, not yet having lowered his guard. The door showed signs of forced entry. His voice is lowered to be just short of a whisper in case they aren't alone. Rationalizing the situation and the possibilities, he deems it possible that somebody could have napped or mailed Akatani. Scouchy isn't quite as convinced, but nods along anyways. Aizawa is renowned for conspiracy theories, and despite some of those notions being proven true, that's his reason for his reluctance. Not to mention the recent news footage showing Akatani back in action as the Tokyo Ghoul. Scouchy has to imagine he isn't the only one with resurfacing memories of the crime scenes Akatani had left behind in the beginning. The detective searches a bathroom, finding discarded box dye. Each container is for a black coloring. Akatani had no doubt been changing his hair hue to hide his idini. Scouchy notes the detail before checking the shower, sink, and toilet for damage. When he finds nothing broken, it's safe to presume that the demolition had been limited to other confines of the house. He has half a mind to check the pantries and the fridge, but pauses in the hallway when he finds Aizawa back by the front entrance. The underground hero is surveying the door's damage, intent on proving whatever thought he has about its hinges being forcibly removed as valid. It was kicked in. Aizawa senses Scouchy's eyes on him and addresses the detective without bothering to return the look. The hero gestures towards a marking that indicates he's right, dead in the center. A shoe imprint the same size as the one from the blood bank. Scouchy balks at first, but quickly recovers when he sees the same evidence that Aizawa does. He mulls over the plausibility and the assumptions that can be made from that piece of information before remembering what Aizawa had theorized about Akatani's partner that night, the girlfriend. Aizawa has his own memory recollection of recent incidents, such as his phone call with the boy and his introduction to the girl not too long ago. Yes, the girlfriend. He tries to keep any judgment out of his tone but fails. Picking up on the way Aizawa sounds, Scouchy raises a brow. You think she's a bad influence, he wonders. The underground hero looks between the door that was busted down and the detective before answering, I don't know yet. He then pushes past Scouchy to inspect the other damages. She couldn't have been the one to have caused all this. Scouchy rests his thumb against his bottom lip, chewing its nail as he contemplates things too. Even if she's a P-girl, it isn't impossible for her to have a quirk that grants strength of such capacity. For a moment, the thought of his dear friend Toshinori comes to mind, and how he as a hero flexes into a muscle form, the unassuming average form he has when not saving the day, as All Might doesn't give the slightest hint of power that he's capable of. How can you be so sure? The detective asks. Aizawa pulls his goggles down so that they hang around his neck along with the capture cloth he wears like a scarf. With his eyes uncovered, he meets Scouchy's gaze. I'm assuming she's one and the same girl that he saved from Endeavor's flames during the Hosu news report. If she were capable of such destruction here, I doubt she would have required rescue. He sounds more contemplative than certain of his words. However, before Scouchy can point that out and poke holes in the hero's hypothesis, Aizawa continues. And if Akatani was capable of the entire Yakuza, then I doubt a single individual would give him any trouble. Or, without a larger amount of property damage, at least, the two find themselves glancing back at the door. There's no real way of knowing what happened, but we shouldn't be making assumptions either. Scouchy waves for Aizawa to follow him. There's more variables to be considered here anyways. The underground hero is led into the bathroom where the detective picks up an empty hair dye container to hand over for inspection. It could simply be that Akatani decided to run away with his girlfriend. Typical teenage romance. And last night was just them being at the wrong place at the wrong time. Aizawa's expression doesn't appear as hopeful as he sounds. He doesn't believe his own words, and neither does Scouchy when he thinks about it for more than a second. He did sound strange on the phone when he was saying goodbye to Eri. As though it would be his last, Aizawa weighs the dye box in his hand like it's heavier than it actually is as he mulls over his last conversation with Akatani. Scouchy hesitates to say this next part, uncertain of how Aizawa will react, but works up enough courage to do so anyways. I know you promised not to pry into his past. But I think we're way past promises at this point. Aizawa hears Scouchy, but doesn't react. He just keeps staring at the dye box in his hand. Akitani had purposely altered his appearance. The boy has a reason for lying about his name. Under ordinary circumstances, it wouldn't be Aizawa's or anyone else's place to delve into why without his consent. Aizawa had grown close to the kid and his illegitimate sister. Aizawa doesn't want to betray their trust by compromising the relationship they've established. And yet, you're right, he must also be rational about the investigation. If we're going to find him, then we need to know who it is that we're actually looking for. He discards the die box and hardens his resolve. Scouchy does his best to look encouraging as he agrees, and that'll tell us where to look. Then he takes out his cell phone to text Tamakawa orders. I'll see what I can uncover at the precinct using what we already know about him, but I'm thinking we shouldn't limit ourselves. Aizawa takes less than a second to decipher the unspoken request from the detective, and his answer is a solid, no. Scouchy looks up from his phone mid-typing with an appalled expression, but Aizawa stays firm, shaking his head. It's never a good idea to get him involved when it comes to children. Whoever allowed that mammal to teach at a school is just as sick and delusional as he is. He knows exactly who it is that the detective wants to bring in on the investigation, and he downright refuses to make things all the more chaotic by agreeing. Scouchy tries not to look or sound too amused by how resolute the underground hero is being. I feel like talking like that could cost you your job. He's not taking Aizawa's words that seriously. Seeing that's the case, Aizawa turns almost somber. He rarely wears his emotions on his sleeve, but he's rather adamant when it comes to Akitani. I just don't want him getting any ideas. This one is a delicate matter. He treats the boy with fragility as much as he does the girl he's adopted. Scouchy can't help but sympathize with the man and places a consoling hand on his shoulder to say as gently as possible, it could be more fragile than you already think it is. When Aizawa looks the detective in the eye, he sees the sincerity and understands the importance without needing the added, that's why we need to know. He tries to resist, but finally gives in. Aizawa brushes Scouchy's hand off his shoulder, fine, and heads for the exit. I'll talk to Nezu. Scouchy watches Aizawa's receding back, but doesn't bother chasing after it. After all, he has to treat the scene properly and get a forensics team over. The detective turns around to get one last good look at the mess that's been made. He doesn't want to regret giving the boy a chance, but he's not so sure he's dealing with a basic boy. All the bee that's been spilled and all the lies that have been told. Just who is Akitani Mikumo? Was he always just the Tokyo ghoul in disguise? When the trio of league candidates first enter the bar, their initial impression of the barren brick walls is that the significantly spacious hideaway is just short of being a less than decorative basement dwelling. Muted colors of bottles on the shelves behind the bar counter match the unadorned lazy spin of the ceiling fan. The place itself seems just as disinteresting as its disinterested patrons. A man with faded blue hair sits with his back to Akitani, Dabi, and Himiko. The living purple mist behind the counter faces the group instead, the only one well dressed for the occasion. Not even Giran, the intermediary middleman, bothers with a classy fashion sense. He opts to wear nothing more chic than a fluffy scarf and circular glasses. I've got some kids here saying they're interested in your group. I assure you, these ones are more capable than the last bunch. Not like the other recruits. He twists a toothpick in his mouth with his tongue as he speaks. However, the slight slurring of words is still decipherable. Akitani and the others are expecting who they assume is the bartender to speak in response, but it's the blue-haired man that Giran happened to be actually addressing. And who are they? He turns his head just enough for the trio to get a glimpse of his chapped lips grinding out his questions. Giran grins, all teeth minus one in the middle on full display. He gestures towards the bunch with a mild flourish, as though he's presenting them. I'll let them speak for themselves. His eyes glint the same as his tinted glasses when he glances towards the group that he's brought. Himiko, the most enthusiastic of the trio, is the first to jump at the opportunity of an introduction. You're friends with Mr. Staney, right? We've been looking for you. She practically vibrates in place as her face tinges red in excitement. The blue-haired man does bother to spare a glance over his shoulder, but it's a rather dismissive look. He has red eyes crusted around the edges that flick over to Dabi instead. You don't look like very much of a league. You look rather gross, actually. Dabi returns the critical gaze with one of his own squinted glares. Hearing that must strike a nerve, because the man returns to his former state, no longer considering them worthy of a second glance. Kurogiri. Warp them away. He lazily waves a hand as though he's shooing away a fly. Akatani mentally notes the bartender's name and potential teleportation quirk before listening to the rest: a brat, a guy with no manners, and a silent creep. I don't like any of them. Himiko's earlier excitement diminishes a little, an expression of disappointment overcoming her as she s her head to the side. Huh. The one named Kurogiri gives the girl somewhat of an apologetic glance before denying the blue-haired man's request. Come now, they've traveled all this way just to meet you. You may as well humor them with a chat. Kurogiri's gaze then shifts to Giran. What's more, if they're being introduced by our influential broker friend here, we can be sure that they're at least competent fighters. Giran shrugs, not elaborating on whether they are or aren't. Akatani doesn't know how acquainted Himiko and Dabi are with him for him to actually know, plus the broker had only met him personally very recently to definitely not know, but it's a response he can get behind during a sensitive negotiation. Either way, I'll take my finder's fee now. Giran holds out his hand with the expectation of receiving payment. But Kurogiri isn't quite as accommodating a second time. He raises up his own hand, introductions first, denying the request momentarily. Giran begrudgingly retracts his hand and nods for the trio to share the names. I'm Himiko Toga. Akatani's girlfriend does the liberty of starting him off, and this is Akatani. I go by Dabi right now. Dabi does his own introduction. Himiko and Akatani, knowing his real name, share a look with one another, but don't say anything out loud. The blue-haired man turns around, now giving him all his undivided attention. No good. I want to know your real name. But he singles out Dabi with a pointed finger specifically. Before things can escalate, Akatani decides that it's finally time that he says something. He takes a step forward to direct everyone's attention to him before announcing, I'm the Tokyo Ghoul. Everyone aside from Himiko shares an expression that crosses both shock and awe. But Akatani isn't finished. He looks around the small bar, still only counting 2 people present. And you're the League of Villains. Is this really all of you? It's his turn to be unimpressed by what he sees. The blue-haired man seems skeptical, his critical gaze from earlier returning full swing. But he still humors Akatani. Yes, I'm the leader. Now knowing that he's finally found the last of his targets and that they're of small numbers, with the leader right in front of him, he's already calculating how to kill them. The leader taps a finger on the bar counter as he demands from Akatani, prove you are who you say you are. His sclera darkening, the ghoul obliges. A predatory instinct kicks in, back burning to unleash his equivalent of claws. He remembers Aizawa's bandages, Eri's guardian and his previously poor condition within the UA medbay. Akatani plans to return the favor. The ghoul growls as he prepares to pounce. Oh, I intend to. But as forthwith as his killing intent had expanded, it instantaneously evaporates. An equal force opposes his own, casting over him like the shadow of a bigger beast. Akatani's burning blood runs cold when he hears an amused chuckle coming from behind the bar counter. His eyes are drawn to the source of intimidation, spotting a miniature television that says, only audio, in kanji as red as his shrunken pupils. No need. The disembodied voice is deceptively soothing. Hidden in the tone, is that same dominant power Akatani had sensed. It's a deep and demanding boom. I would like a private audience with our most prestigious guest, if you mind. The League of Villains leader doesn't seem so much like the actual leader anymore when he inquisitively stares at the small TV monitor. Sensei. The owner of the voice remains in charge, making it clear that was an order and not a request. Take time to get acquainted with his friends, Tomura. You may learn a thing or two about companionship and allegiance. They sound as though they're talking down to a child. The power dynamic and who reigns in superiority is more evident than ever. It'd be funny if it weren't so terrifying. The voice returns, making Akatani shudder. He's pretty sure that voice belongs to the devil. This is the first time you've felt inferior to another out of a naturally born instinct. Isn't it? The tone is genuinely inquisitive rather than taunting. That only intensifies the effect of the feeling he's unable to endure. He feels like an ant that's being studied, played with, by a giant that could squash it at any moment it loses interest. All Akatani can manage is a meek nod. His mind is too distraught to think of a verbal response. Though he'd doubtfully be capable of formulating any coherent speech if he were thinking clearly. Akatani recluses at the close proximity of the voice. You have no conception of how far up the food chain goes, boy. It sounds so close and yet so distant at the same time. The most lethal of predators are good at concealing their bloodlust. You should take that advice into practice. I could easily sense your hostile intent towards Tomura. Akitani recognizes the tone as the same that had been used with the so-called Tomura. He's being talked down to, perceived as an inferior child. In the presence of this being, he knows that to be true. Have you nothing to say for yourself, boy? Akitani's throat is too dry to say anything. Until, the same force that commands him to be docile demands that he speak. He's a threat. Akitani's voice trembles more than his body as he admits to the desire of wanting Tomura dead. He knows he can be smitted easily should the owner of the voice so deem it, and he's just given him a valid reason. To the child you've grown an attachment with, the true leader of the League of Villains shocks Akitani even more. He's shaken to his core that such an unstoppable force knows about his relationship to Eri as the reason for their being at odds. Don't be so surprised. I'm capable of reading your thoughts like an open book. Through all the terror and desperation, it's easy to find the root of those emotions. Akitani struggles to breathe as he takes in that information. His mind is capable of being invaded, his thoughts read, and quite possibly corrupted. He theorizes that the feeling he's perceiving from the Mindreda's presence comes from that same source of power. But part of him knows that a good margin is genuinely just the person's unmitigated existence. Unfortunately, I cannot allow you to end Tomura. He is of importance to me. He's reminded of that aura when it washes over him like a wave in an ever-endless bottomless sea. However, I see a potential in you that would be a shame to waste. You could prove useful to Tomura. Before he can sink to the bottom and drown, crushed by the pressure, he feels himself pulled back to the surface. Akitani gasps for air as he greedily tries to inhale it all for himself. The force that had been weighing down on him has been significantly lifted, but his body still falls to the floor. He's beyond exhausted. Who are you? He tries to get a good look at who caused him such grief. In the thick darkness, he can make out what looks like the equivalent of a throne. Several wires and cables are connected to it, an array of monitors much like the one from the bar also attached. And seated at its center, is a well-dressed man. I have many names. Most prominently, all for one, in account for my abundance of quirks and the unique ability to take more from others. The promise of power from that introduction alone has Akitani quivering all over again. But when he sees the face belonging to that power, he's beyond horrified. But you will call me Sensei. The scarred flesh where eyes should be somehow stares into Akitani's soul more than actual eyes would be able to. Why you plan to take my quirk from me? It suddenly makes sense to him how someone could be so limitlessly indomitable. Oh, what's this? A kindling of hope that I hear. All for one tilts his head to the side as he outwardly notes Akitani's tone. How interesting. Akitani imagines a life without his quirk. If it weren't for his uncontrollable impulses and his extreme urges, he would have been able to lead a regular life. His mother would still be alive. Maybe, just maybe, he would have been able to still get into UA with Kaken. I can only view your thoughts so much. Would you be opposed to meeting a quirk specialist colleague of mine? All for one's intrigue sends shivers down Akitani's spine and he begins to regret the desire to bear rid of his quirk. He can't imagine someone so evil increasing their strength with his quirk too. What do you want from me? Akitani struggles to push himself upwards. It takes all he has, but he somehow manages to push off with his hands and just stay on his knees. All for one watches the boy with sick pleasure, smiling softly as he enjoys the entertaining display. He speaks at a low decibel, almost assuredly, not your quirk. Though powerful, it wouldn't pale in comparison to my arsenal, but conveys anything but a form of assurance. I'm much more interested in your mind, especially when he extends a hand. Akitani instinctively shies away from the near contact, all sorts of alarms and warnings going off in his head. Especially when he sees something crawling beneath the surface of the man's sleeve. The length and size of all for one's fingers, a red-headed centipede twists itself around his hand and reaches towards Akitani. Acting on a survival reflex, his senses telling him it's no ordinary insect, the boy scurries back faster than the actual bug crawls. Akitani pants heavily, his unnatural pupils focused on the centipede that reaches just short of his face. Its preformal spines twiddle in an attempt at making contact. If all for one is displeased, he doesn't show it. If anything, he finds the reaction humorous, letting out a low chuckle. He pulls his arm away, the centipede retreating back under his sleeve. We'll both have to test our patience then. He lifts the same hand he had used to prop his chin against his knuckles, another time. Akitani swallows in between heavy breaths, unable to express anything but relief that he hadn't been subjected to whatever All for One literally had up his sleeve. Though he also can't help but be unsettled by the unspoken promise of another time. He shakily lifts his head, daring to look at the man responsible for such an impending feeling of absolute damnation. The business attire is almost as casual as his sitting position, the lack of a tie and the few loose buttons at the top are nonchalant. Yet, the face that wears it all is just like the aura he emits. A horrifically sinister contortion of what a person's worst self can be, personified as a form of evil. Even without sockets, Akitani can feel All for One's eyes on him. He's not sure how the man can see, but he knows that he must. He can't help but shake the feeling of being studied like he's bacteria under a microscope. You will return to Tomura and agree to work with him. You will not harm him if you don't want the same to be done to the girls you're so fond of. Akitani feels small in comparison to the potential menace of this particular predator. He has no choice but to accept the true monster's conditions, now knowing his role in the criminal climate has drastically changed. The threat to Eri and Himiko is one that can be delivered on and he'd be unable to do anything about it. He's been caged again, this time by something far worse than the heroes. He remembers what All for One wished to be addressed as and answers, "Why yes, sensei." All for One's smile becomes even more wicked, if that's even possible. The Tokyo Ghoul is now his pet. Akitani grits his teeth together, blaming his discoloration on his newly appointed sensei. Just thinking of the devil's personification makes him shudder and sweat. When his mind returns to the present and no longer lingers on that dark room which may as well have been hell, he sees Kurogiri waiting patiently. Akitani clears his throat and starts to deny the food offering. "I don't have any money. It's on the house," but gets interrupted as politely as possible. Even Kurogiri's tone sounds sympathetically considerate. Akitani eyes the bartender warily, not buying into the act. He's not forgetting the man is a villain that works under the employ of someone far worse. Besides, he has a valid reason for denying the food. "My diet isn't like others." He tries pushing the packaged meal away. But Kurogiri blocks his attempt by resting his own hand on the parcel too. "We at the League of Villains took that into account." He pushes back as gently as possible. Akitani allows the bartender to slide it more into his space out of curiosity. Akitani eyes the small brown blocks with a sneaking suspicion. His nose tells him that they aren't drugged or poisoned, so he trusts in his senses. "Sure, I'll try it." He figures there's nothing to lose if it'll help quench his appetite. Judging by the upturn of the bartender's yellow slants for eyes, Akitani assumes Kurogiri is smiling. "You won't regret it." He adds the cubes to the coffee concoction before placing the cup in front of the boy. Akitani blows on the steaming drink before taking a sip. To his surprise, it tastes better than any other coffee he's had prior. It also helps to sober him to his surroundings and clear the fog in his mind. Glancing around the bar, he questions the first thing that he failed to notice until now: where's Himiko and Dabi? Kurogiri grabs a rag and busies himself with cleaning a shot glass as he answers, "With Tomura. Like you, they were re-evaluated and welcomed into the fold." Remembering Tomura's hostility when first meeting his friends, that explanation doesn't do much to allay Akitani's concerns about their absence. But where? He stresses the emphasis of his inquiry to get a better answer. Taking note of Akitani's worries, Kurogiri pauses his cleaning to assure the boy, "They're safe. We have no intention of harming our own allies." And then elaborates on their whereabouts per request. "You have a residence here as well. They're being shown their rooms." At that, Akitani raises his eyebrows in a combination of confusion and interest. Food and bed. Is this a hotel or a bar? He tries to play it off as a joke but can't help but imagine what he and Himiko would have done otherwise. Part of him wonders if Dabi would have let them stay with him, if he even has a place of his own. The money he saved from working at Anteiku wouldn't have got them further than a few weeks. "Are you not grateful?" Kurogiri resumes wiping down glasses now that the mood has shifted to something more light-hearted. Though, that doesn't last very long. Akitani doesn't want to owe a debt to the League. He doesn't want to be shown hospitality by villains. He may be deterred by Sensei momentarily, but he refuses to forget his goal. Kurogiri and Tomura are still his targets. He'll kill them. Not today. Nor tomorrow. But eventually. So he answers Kurogiri with a curt, "No. I'm not." Meanwhile, Akutani's yesterday catches up with him. There's no outrunning his past when a certain rat is running the maze. After class hours, Aizawa enters Nezu's office for a discussion that he'd been dreading the entire teaching day. He's filled with even more despair when he finds Detective Scouchy also there with one of his students. Bakugo. It's after school hours. Shouldn't you be at home? Aizawa fixes his focus on the spiky-haired blonde first. Though Nezu is quick to confirm the teacher's suspicion of the boy's presence, actually Aizawa, Mr. Bakugo is here per my request, much to his dismay. Aizawa sighs before also taking a seat, getting settled in for the long haul of what he's sure ought to be a headache-inducing conversation. And why is one of my students present for this? You'll never guess the coincidence. Scouchy glances over at the underground hero before nodding towards Nezu. The principal returns the gesture before turning the computer screen on his desk to face the other way. On the monitor is a green-haired boy with a face full of freckles. Meet Izuku Midoriya. Bakugo frowns. Scouchy stares at Aizawa from the corner of his eye. Aizawa finds the face familiar but can't quite place it until Nezu reveals the Idini for him, or as you may have come to know him, Akutani Mikumo. Aizawa's eyes broaden when he places the features. The outdated picture shows an extreme evolution occurred, but the kid is undeniably one and the same. What's Bakugo got to do with him? Aizawa redirects his attention as he tries to think of a correlation. Bakugo meets his teacher's gaze as he explains, "I grew up with the nerd. I knew him before he." The pause has Aizawa raise a brow. "Before he ran away." Bakugo averts his eyes. The avoidance of eye contact has Aizawa asking, "Ran away?" Bakugo nods. When he realizes his teacher is waiting on a verbal answer, he elaborates, "After his mom died, he just vanished." His mother? Aizawa's breath hitches as he starts to learn about Akutani Izuku Midoriya's past. Shit got really F. His quirk manifested and he bit me. Then he stopped coming to school. Then his mom, she was. The details of Bakugo's recollection start to come fast but end on a more somber note. He fa Auntie Inko. It suddenly makes sense to Aizawa why the boy was so intent on covering up his past. The disdain for his own quirk and how he had to cope with its effects. He's only a child and he had reformatted his whole Idini to accommodate for the danger he saw in himself. All Aizawa can manage to say instead of a swear word is, "Christ." Detective Scouchy and I had similar reactions, but I'm afraid you're a little late to receiving that information for us to dwell too long on it. Nezu unsympathetically brushes it aside in order to move on with his other findings. But Aizawa is still processing the travesty for him to be as eager, the kid or his own mother. Let's just calm down. Please, Aizawa, have a seat. Scouchy rests a hand on the underground hero's shoulder to keep him from standing up. Nezu also makes an attempt to de-escalate the situation. Would you like a cup of tea? Though all the principal's suggestion does is earn another glare from Aizawa, no. I would not. Suit yourself. Nezu easily shrugs it off. He continues with his casual demeanor to type into the system and pull up a new file. While Mr. Midoriya's mother is no longer with us, we shouldn't neglect the boy's father. Auntie Inko always said the deadbeat worked overseas. Bakugo provides his relatively helpful input about the matter from the sidelines. And Scouchy bounces off of it to also explain, which is why it'll be difficult to get a hold of him for questioning. Aizawa doesn't like the sounds of that, but waits to hear more before asking anything. The computer screen switches to a new photo ID, this one a splitting image of Izuku if he were aged up by 20 to 30 years. Hisashi Midoriya. Nothing too abnormal about his record. Although, I do find the lack of concern for his wife or son rather odd. He never left America for her funeral, nor did he bother to search for young Midoriya. Nezu provides a rundown of the information he's gathered on the man. But Aizawa doesn't find any of it the least bit helpful. That doesn't mean he'd have anything to offer if we could speak with him. That just means he's in a hole. My thoughts exactly. Nezu beams with a smile like the lack of a lead is a good thing. Scouchy draws everyone's attention to him when he voices that problem out loud. Despite learning more about the kid, we're not left with many leads. Though not without a small caveat towards Aizawa. Nezu and I were hoping you might be able to get something out of this. The underground hero recoils at the implication. He figured the rat would have some delusional gimmick in mind for solving the investigation, but he hadn't expected it from Scouchy. He wonders just what exactly they have in mind. They thought you'd be able to get through to me, or whatever. Bakugo's grumbled answer from the corner wasn't what Aizawa had been expecting either. The blonde crosses his arms as he continues to growl, "It's not about opening up. If I knew something about the nerd, I'd tell you. I seriously haven't seen him since he ran off." Suddenly, Aizawa has an epiphany. The connection with Bakugo reminds him that there are other students in his class who may also have ties with Midoriya. Todoroki had been mentioned by Eri, as well as Shinso, who he had taken under his wing ever since the sports festival. Actually, Bakugo isn't the only student under my tutelage with a connection to aka Midoriya. He starts to find the intel from the meeting all the more insightful now that he's actually got more leads. Bakugo shakes his head in dismissal of the possibility. The nerd didn't have any other friends besides me growing up. But Aizawa shakes his head too. These are more recent. Having all the more reason to be hopeful of these potential leads. They might know where to find him. Scouchy starts to catch on and agrees that they could make or break the case. Nezu folds his paws neatly, leaning back in his chair with as chipper an attitude as ever. "Well, let's invite them in for some tea, shall we?" His tiny grin implies that he sees more of an opportunity than they do. "Does the name Izuku Midoriya mean anything to either of you?" Aizawa stares down at the two boys seated on the most comfortable couch within UA's teacher lounge. He figured the setting would be much more relaxing than Nezu's office and as such would make them more inclined to answer his questions. No, he was just hoping for a better answer from Todoroki. One not so curt, at the very least. "Who?" And Shinso's response happens to somehow be even worse. Aizawa refrains from slapping a hand against his face, instead opting for a glance towards Scouchy. The detective indicates that neither of them are lying, assuming that's the reason for the side eye. "Okay, let's try that again." The teacher sighs in frustration before attempting a different approach. "How do you two boys know Akitani Mikumo?" Shinso and Todoroki exchange a look between themselves, nondiscreetly. A moment of silence passes before they face their teacher and the detective again. "Why are you asking?" Shinso asks with what sounds like a hint of suspicion. Aizawa likes to believe he knows the boy well enough from their training that he recognizes the tone as inquisitive instead though. Is Mikumo in some kind of trouble? Todoroki on the other hand is much more readable as concerned despite his usually stoic demeanor. "Unfortunately, we can't disclose any information at this time." Scouchy chimes in from the sides to plug any potential leaks in the investigation that Aizawa could cause. Taking that as an indication to treat his students as a little more than children, Aizawa sighs once more before basically begging, "Please, answer the question. We first met in a coffee shop that he works at." Todoroki's heteromorphic eyes settle on Aizawa's gaze as he tries to gauge his teacher just as much as he's being studied. "Anteiku. I'm familiar with the place." Aizawa nods along but can't hide the disappointment in his tone. He was hoping that this would be a lead to someplace else. "Then he introduced me to Shinso." Todoroki passing the torch to the other boy does rekindle some of the underground hero's hope though. "I knew Mikumo for longer, especially when Shinso says that." Aizawa eagerly listens for the boy's backstory. When Shinso blushes in embarrassment, he isn't expecting the explanation he gets. "We met at a quirk support group." Only after Aizawa mulls the answer over does he realize, that makes sense. Shinso and Midoriya were both contemptuous of their own quirks. Regardless, he's relieved to discover something new that may help him and Scouchy find Midoriya. He asks, "Do you know if he still attends any of the meetings?" "We haven't seen him lately." Todoroki shakes his head as he answers for both himself and Shinso. His head then hangs somberly until he raises it again to ask, "Is he okay?" Wanting to provide some form of comfort for his student, Aizawa assures him, "That's what we wish to know too. Could you provide us with an address to that support group?" Scouchy reinserts himself to get things back on track and away from emotional vulnerability though. In his hands are a pad and pencil to write things down. Aizawa isn't sure how he didn't notice the detective was taking notes until now. Sure, it might be worth checking still. Shinso goes along with Scouchy's request while Todoroki seemingly stares off into space. Not wanting either of his students to be left to their own musings about the matter, Aizawa clears his throat to ask, "Is there anything else you might be able to tell us about him?" He has a younger sister named Eri, But Shinso is still the only one to continue providing any intel. Though the info does hold its fair share of surprises, he said she's in America with her father right now. I see. Aizawa and Scouchy share a quick glance that's easily missed by the boys. Midoriya had lied about Eri's caretaker to Shinso, considering Aizawa is currently her guardian and he's far from America. Anything else? Scouchy continues prying for more information as he notes the potential relevance. No, but Todoroki finally speaks up to shut him down. That's all we know. Aizawa knows Scouchy will want to keep applying pressure, but he gives in before the detective can. Okay then. It's a judgment call only he can make, considering they're his students. If there's anything else, you know to grab me after class. Before or during if it can't wait. He gestures for them to leave. Thank you for your time. You're dismissed. Yes, sensei. See you at the summer camp. Todoroki is the first to stand. He gives a short bow before going, Shinso following shortly after him. Seems Midoriya keeps his friends at an arm's width. Scouchy finishes writing his final takeaways before closing his notepad and turning towards Aizawa. But Aizawa is much too consumed by his thoughts to return the gesture, if he even considers them his friends at all. The mystery of who Izuku Midoriya is himself is just as elusive as the people that he acquaints himself with. His strange girlfriend who's also an enigma. His childhood friend who is no longer in contact. Shinso and Todoroki. The Yakuza and Eri. And that mask shop owner. Aizawa turns to face Scouchy, coming up with yet another potential lead based on his pure hunches. Uta stands in the center of his store, looking at the group of customers that currently occupy the space. Quite frankly, he hadn't encountered such an oddball group since the Yakuza, and they paled in comparison to this wacky bunch. All he can manage to get out of his mouth is an uttered under the breath, "What the?" Standing beside him, Akatani Mikumo is well within earshot to hear it. And he has no qualms about agreeing with the mask maker. I know, right? One of the bunch that's been brought in is currently looking over a hockey mask. Hey. This one's pretty good. He grins while weighing it in his hand. I think I'll take it. He's a large muscular blonde with a missing eye, but yet somehow still doesn't manage to stick out from the crowd as the strangest. Not when a man in a black and gray skin-tight bodysuit agrees that it's not bad, before immediately going back on his own word. It's horrendous. Too generic. Do you have any gas masks? There's also a boy in a school uniform. He looks younger than even Akatani and Himiko, the age of which one can turn to villainy bewildering. Uta points in a general direction while giving better verbal directions, third shelf to your right. But his focus is still on the two that he knows the best. He turns back towards Akatani and Himiko. When I said bring your friends, I wasn't expecting. Disinterested in their conversation or shopping for a disguise, Dabi rolls his eyes before interrupting to ask, is it okay if I smoke in here? Uta spares a quick glance towards Dabi, I'd rather you not, before brushing him off. Dabi shrugs, I'd rather wait outside anyways, heading for the exit, let me know when you're all finished shopping for Halloween. No fun, Himiko pouts as she watches him leave. Yeah, party pooper. The man wearing a bodysuit agrees before going back on his word for a second time, this place stinks. I wanna leave too. The extreme bipolarism earns a few looks. One of the judgmentals is a villain covered in scales. I'm going to stick with my stain apparel, if you all don't mind. He's one of the few to already be wearing an outfit. You mean Stain cosplay? Himiko teases him a little about the obviously inspired costume. It's not cosplay, but he's obviously touchy about the look. Pretty. So pretty. Another suited individual mutters to himself in a corner. He fidgets and twitches as he repeats himself, no, no. Can't. No. It's as though the leather harness and straitjacket he's got on is barely enough to restrain whatever psychotic urges he's holding back. So uncivilized. A man with a top hat dismisses the odd character before lifting up a mask of his selection. It fits perfectly over his face. I've taken a liking to this one. Rather fitting to my theme, is it not? Meh. The bipolar villain both disagrees and agrees, dashing. You're all crazy. I'm joining Dabi outside. Another of the large group shakes their head in disapproval before also leaving. Much to Himiko's disavail, oh, come on, Mag. Don't spoil the fun. This isn't exactly my definition of fun, either, Himiko. We're not here to make friends. Akatani crosses his arms as he watches the crowd carefully. Tomura and Kurogiri increased the number of members in such a short span of time. Now it's more enemies that'll have to die. But we're a team. We've got to bond a little. Himiko grabs onto Akitani's arm so she can jerk and shake him per her usual exaggeration. It was her idea to go out as a group that he doesn't know whether or not she's caught onto the fact that the League is still enemies, and what better way than to go mask shopping. What he's saying doesn't go unheard by Himiko. See. You two sound like you'd get along. But when Akitani looks at the man, he sees the worst side of himself that he'd never want to associate with. He sees someone who's truly villainous and lost to the hunger of evil. He's not even sure if what sounds like a fellow cannibal is capable of functioning with the group. To lose oneself to the craze and never return. To lose all sense of self and be driven out of your mind. What he sees is what he himself could have become. What he could still become. He hates it. He hates them. Just like all the other villains. Hell no, Akitani's eyes burn as they glare at the guy. Sensing the boy's hostility and noticing the emergence of his Kakugan, Uta tries redirecting the focus and attention back to himself. This isn't going to be a repeat of the Yakuza, is it? He recalls the last time things went awry and wishes to avoid another situation like that. Akitani gives a non-committed shrug in response. It's difficult to know whether he's joking or not when he says, "Don't tempt me." As if the ghoul needs any more reasons to get riled up, the leader of the League enters the shop to join them. He's currently got a hand attached to his face, red eyes peering out between the finger gaps. His gaze is just as angry as Akitani's as he barks a question, "What the hell's taking so long in here?" Himiko, undeterred by the harsh tone, makes a cheerful suggestion. "Hanzi, you should get a new mask too." Her nickname for him earns a glare. "Don't touch father." Tomura protectively places his own hand over the one covering his face. "Father." Akitani doesn't miss the odd affection in Tomura's tone as opposed to the usual disdain he hears. Neither does Uta. This group is sounding more freakish by the second, who's clearly had enough of the bunch. Ignoring everyone's remarks, Tomura fixates himself solely on Akitani. He approaches the boy, stopping short by just a few feet to stand over him. "You, ghoul, I want to speak with you." He tries giving an order. "That makes one of us," but Akitani isn't the least bit intimidated. Overhearing the interaction, the burly blonde member of the League excitedly turns to face them. "Ghoul, no way, you're just a kid." He grins ear to ear in amusement over their standoff while also fantasizing the future. "Man, that makes me excited to see what you'll do when you're my age." Akitani's just further irritated when the muscular villain adds, "Big fan. I wonder what Stain saw in you." The Stain cosplayer with a reptiliation mutation quirk also takes an interest in Akitani upon discovering his identity as the Tokyo Ghoul. Akitani sighs. He'd rather deal with Tomura individually than have to handle the whole group of villains. Besides, Sensei restricts him from eliminating Tomura that he may as well play along for the time being anyways. Suddenly, getting out of here doesn't seem like such a bad idea. He agrees to speak with Tomura privately for his sanity's sake. "You can use the back office." Uta helpfully gestures with his single hand towards the private area. To which Akitani gives a grateful nod in return. "Thanks, Uta." Tomura follows Akitani into the back room when he shuts the door so they can be alone and unheard. Akitani turns on the villain leader and asks, "So, what is it? What did Sensei want to speak with you in private about?" Tomura scratches under his chin down to his neck as he gets straight to the point. Akitani raises a brow, wondering why Tomura cares to know. That kinda defeats the purpose of a private conversation, doesn't it? He's not even sure if All for One wants his protege to know about their meeting anyways. "You work for ME, brat. Just tell me." But Tomura quickly loses his patience. Knowing Tomura has a tendency to lash out when losing his temper and that he can't fight back, Akitani decides to just lie. "He was interested in my reputation and wanted to know my reasons for joining." He shrugs it off as no big deal so the questioning can end. "Nothing special. Nobody other than me ever caught his special interest before." But Tomura isn't quite convinced. "While your ranking on the scoreboard is impressive, I'm not convinced that you're more than an NPC just yet." Akitani rolls his eyes while thinking of the other people they recruited. "Compared to the group that you put together here, I'd beg to differ." Clearly not expecting that sassy response, Tomura can't help but smirk beneath the hand covering his mouth. "Maybe. though he'd never admit to finding the snarky comment amusing. A brief moment of silence passes between the two, Akatani expecting to be asked another question. When nothing comes, he takes the opportunity for himself. Can I ask you something now? Tomura's smile quickly drops. Depends. But he can't help but be the least bit curious. When you attacked UA, who was your target? Akatani eyes the villain as he searches for motive and reason other than causing havoc. He's not sure what it is that he'll find the longer that he stares. That wretched excuse for a hero, All Might, of course. Why? Tomura dismisses the question as though the answer is obvious though. Akatani thinks of Aizawa covered in bandages. He remembers Todoroki is part of that class. So everyone else was just collateral damage. He holds a grudge that only reignites tenfold the more he thinks of how Eri could have also potentially been dragged into the conflict. NPCs always are. Tomura scoffs without any consideration that collateral damage is wrong. But he does find himself more intrigued by the ghoul. Why are you so interested? Akatani finds Tomura's eyes, green meeting red. Because not everyone is an NPC, he hopes his words resonate as he tries to speak in a language the villain will understand. You might have strength, but there's always someone with higher stats. Like yourself, Tomura narrows his gaze. He's taking it as a threat. Maybe. Which Akatani doesn't mind. Though he did originally mean all for one in regards to himself, hoping to reach Tomura through relatability for whatever reason. He shakes it off and regards it as just trying to know his enemy better. What's your quirk, by the way? Tomura doesn't respond at first. He takes a second to huff in laughter before grabbing a stray mask with 4 fingers. When the 5th joins the other digits, the mask starts to crumble. Would you really like to compare? Tomura holds his stare with Akatani as his quirk decays the face covering until there's nothing left. Akatani would be lying if he said he wasn't impressed, but he doesn't show it. You know you're gonna have to pay for that, right? He instead points to the pile of dust with a deadpan expression. Tomura tsks before facing away and placing his hand on the door handle to leave. Let me know when you're ready for Kurogiri to warp us out of here. He gives one last parting sentence of acknowledgement before exiting. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.